The thin grey lights of early morning spread across the wide Genesee valley, touching the tops of the trees and the low hills in the distance. The air was cool and still, carrying the smell of damp earth and wet grass. Along the line where the Erie Canal was being cut, the world lay quiet except for the soft murmur of a distant stream and the first tentative bird calls. The sky was a pale wash of grey and silver, with only a faint hint of warmer colour near the horizon where the sun had not yet appeared. In a simple camp set back from the ditch, a canvas tarp stretched between two poles offered a modest shelter. Under it, on a bed of straw covered with a wool blanket, the digger stirred. He did not rise all at once, but moved slowly, as if sleep still held him in its loose grip. First his shoulders shifted, then his head turned, and finally his eyes opened to the pale light that filtered through the open side of the shelter. He lay for a few moments watching the mist rise from the hollows, his breath slow and even, his body reluctant to leave the warmth of the blanket. The stiffness in his back and arms was a familiar reminder of the previous day's labor, a sensation that was not pain but simply presence, the body telling its own quiet story. After a time he pushed the blanket aside and sat up, the straw rustling beneath him. He ran a hand through his hair and rubbed the back of his neck, his movements unhurried. The ground under the shelter was packed earth, smooth from use, and his bare feet found it cool. He pulled on a pair of heavy wool trousers and a linen shirt, the fabric soft from many washings. His boots stood at the edge of the straw, and he tugged them on slowly, lacing them with the ease of long habit. Standing, he ducked under the low edge of the tarp and stepped outside into the early morning. The camp area was a small clearing among tall grasses and scattered maples. A ring of stones held the ashes of yesterday's fire, and a stack of split wood stood nearby, protected by a piece of oilcloth. A tin pot, a cup, and a few wooden utensils lay on a flat rock that served as a makeshift table. Beyond the clearing, the land sloped gently down to the canal cut, which at this hour was just a dark line across the valley, a wound in the earth that had not yet healed into a waterway. The digger gathered a handful of dry grass and a few splinters of kindling, crouching by the fire ring. He struck a flint against a small piece of steel, the sound a sharp click in the stillness, and caught the spark in the charred cloth of his tinderbox. A curl of smoke rose, and he cupped his hands around it, blowing softly until a small flame took hold among the grass. He fed it twigs, then larger sticks, and finally a split log that caught and began to glow. The fire crackled in a subdued way, and its warmth pushed back the cool air around him. He filled the tin pot from a wooden bucket of creek water and set it on a flat stone at the edge of the flames, where it would heat slowly while he prepared himself for the day. Standing again, he stretched his arms overhead and looked out across the valley. The mist was beginning to thin, revealing the contours of the land, the long slope to the south where the hills rose in layers of blue-grey, the darker line of woods along the Genesee River a mile away, and the open fields where tree stumps still dotted the grass. The canal line cut through it all, a surveyed path marked by small flags and stakes, its course a gentle curve that followed the natural lay of the land. He had walked that line many times and knew its dips and rises, as well as he knew the grip of his shovel. The water in the pot began to murmur, and he added a handful of coarse ground coffee, stirring it with a stick. The smell of brewing coffee mixed with the scent of wood smoke and wet grass, a combination that was as much a part of the morning as the light itself. He poured the dark liquid into the tin cup and sat on a stump near the fire, cradling the warm cup in both hands. The first sip was bitter and hot, and it travelled down his throat in a slow, spreading warmth. He did not hurry the coffee. He sat with it, watching the valley come into sharper focus as the sun edged above the hills. When the sun's first direct rays touched the tops of the trees, the light turned from grey to a soft gold, and the dew on the grass began to sparkle in tiny points. Breakfast was a simple affair, a heel of dark bread, a piece of salt pork that he warmed on the end of a stick, and another cup of coffee. He ate slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly, his eyes resting on the middle distance without focusing on anything in particular. The birds had grown bolder now, and their songs filled the air with a patternless chorus. A crow called from the edge of the woods, its voice hoarse and carrying, and somewhere far off a dog barked, perhaps from a farmstead beyond the ridge. These sounds were so familiar that he hardly noticed them. yet they formed the backdrop of his waking hours, a kind of audible landscape that was as constant as the ground under his feet. When the meal was done, he cleaned his cup and pot with a splash of water and set them on the rock to dry. He threw a few handfuls of dirt on the fire to dampen it, leaving a smolder that would be easy to revive later. He walked to the edge of the clearing where his tools waited, propped against the trunk of a young ash tree. The wheelbarrow stood on its two legs, its iron wheel resting in a small hollow, the wooden bed clean and empty. The shovel leaned beside it, the blade dull with use and the long handle smooth from the friction of his hands. He had bought the shovel from a smith in Albany before traveling west to work on the canal. The wheelbarrow had been built right here in the valley by a carpenter who knew the needs of canal diggers, sturdy, balanced, easy to tip and roll. He lifted the shovel first, feeling its weight, and ran his thumb along the edge of the blade. It was not sharp in the way of a cutting tool, but rounded and worn, exactly suited to the work of moving earth. The handle had a slight curve near the top that fit the palm, and a darker spot where the right hand usually gripped, polished by sweat and friction, into a kind of low sheen. He set the shovel across his shoulder and took the handles of the wheelbarrow, tilting it forward onto its wheel with a small thump. The iron axle creaked once, a sound he had heard 1,000 times and would hear 1,000 more, a sound that was like a door swinging open onto the day. He pushed the wheelbarrow out of the clearing and onto the narrow path that ran alongside the canal line. The grass on either side was wet, and the wheel left a faint track in the soft soil. The path curved gently, following the survey stakes that had been driven into the ground months before by engineers with their chains and levels. Each stake had a number written on it in faded ink, and the digger knew his section by those numbers, a stretch of ditch about 30 yards long that he and a few others had been deepening for weeks. The section was his responsibility, a piece of the larger whole that would someday connect the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, but on this particular morning it was simply a job, a place where his hands knew what to do. As he walked, the valley opened up around him. The canal cut ran like a long straight furrow through the landscape, its bottom already several feet below the original ground level in some places, and nearly at grade in others. Piles of excavated earth lay alongside it, forming a low embankment that would become the towpath where mules or horses would someday walk, pulling boats laden with grain and lumber and passengers. But that future was still far off, a faint idea that did not press itself into the daily routine. For now, there was only the ditch, the shovel, and the wheelbarrow. He arrived at his section and set the wheelbarrow on a level spot near the bank. The ditch here was about 3 feet deep, and just as wide, its bottom flat and its walls straight, cut cleanly from the soil. In the bottom of the ditch, the earth was a dark brown, rich with the decay of centuries of meadow grass, shot through with the pale threads of root systems. A few stones lay half embedded in the wall, and he would need to pry them loose later. The work of the previous day ended in a clean vertical face at the far end of the section, where the shovel had left its last cut. He stood at the edge of the ditch for a moment, looking down into the quiet space, the way a person might look into a room before entering. The sun was now fully up, though still low in the east, and its light fell at a long angle across the valley, throwing shadows that stretched and slowly shrank. The warmth of it began to touch the back of his neck and the shoulders of his shirt. He took the shovel from his shoulder and stepped down into the ditch, his boots sinking slightly into the loose dirt at the bottom. The temperature dropped a few degrees inside the ditch, the earth holding the night's coolness, and the walls rose on either side to chest height. It was a small, private space, open to the sky but sheltered from the breeze that moved through the grass above. He worked in a kind of solitude, even when other diggers were nearby in their own sections, because the walls of the ditch absorbed sound and made the world seem farther away. He set the blade of the shovel against the bottom of the vertical face, where the undisturbed soil met the excavated space. He pressed down with his foot on the top edge of the blade, driving it into the earth with a familiar resistance. The sound was a soft crunch, a combination of roots parting and soil compressing and small stones shifting. He levered the handle back, and a clod of earth broke free, falling onto the pile of loosened dirt at his feet. He repeated the motion, sinking the blade, pressing, levering, and the pile grew. Each shovel load was much like the one before, a small portion of the valley being moved from one place to another, and the rhythm of it settled into his body like a slow, steady pulse. His breathing deepened, his shoulders loosened, and his mind drifted into the space between thoughts, occupied only by the immediate sensations of work. After a few minutes, the pile of loose dirt had grown large enough to fill the wheelbarrow. He leaned the shovel against the wall of the ditch and climbed out, then lifted the shovel and began loading the earth into the wheelbarrow, scoop by scoop. The wheelbarrow filled slowly, the mound rising in the wooden bed. He tamped it down with the flat of the shovel so nothing would spill on the path. When it was full, he set the shovel aside, took the handles, and pushed the load along the path to the embankment site about 50 yards away. The wheel creaked steadily, and the wheelbarrow bumped over small ruts. At the embankment, he tilted the barrow forward, and the soil slid out in a rush, spreading itself in a fan shape on the growing pile. Then he turned and walked back, the empty barrow lighter and easier to push. The morning passed in this manner, a quiet repetition that was not marked by minutes, but by the slow progress of the sun across the sky. The shovel rose and fell, the wheelbarrow travelled back and forth, and the ditch deepened by inches. The digger did not count the loads or measure the distance. He simply continued, his body operating in a state of calm attention that required no urgency. From time to time he paused to drink water from a canteen, or to wipe his forehead with the sleeve of his shirt, or simply to stand still and look at the valley around him. During these pauses, he would notice the small changes that had taken place while he worked. The shadows had shifted, the mist had entirely burned off, and the sun's warmth had grown more pronounced. The birds had quieted, and the air was beginning to carry the dry scent of warming grass. By the time the sun approached its midpoint, the digger had made a visible difference in the end wall of his section. The face of the ditch had receded by several inches, and the bottom was clean and level. He had dug out 3 stones and rolled them to the side of the path, where they would later be used for the canal lining. His shirt was damp with sweat, and his hands had a fine coating of dust that had settled into the lines of his palms. He climbed out of the ditch for the last time that morning and stood beside the wheelbarrow looking up at the sky, which had turned from pale grey to a clear, washed blue. The morning was over, and the long middle of the day was about to begin. But for now, there was a pause, a small threshold between the early hours and the heat of noon, and the digger stood in it quietly, letting the stillness settle over him like the light itself. The morning light came again, this time a little later than the day before, or so it seemed to the digger as he walked the path to his section of the canal. He had slept deeply, the kind of sleep that leaves no memory of dreams, and the stiffness in his shoulders had softened into a comfortable warmth. The dew was heavier than it had been, soaking the grass and making the path a dark line of damp earth, and the air had a freshness that promised a mild day, not too hot and not too cool. He carried his canteen and a small cloth bundle of bread, but his tools were already at the worksite, left there the previous evening after being cleaned and set aside. The wheelbarrow stood where he had parked it, near a large stump of a maple that had been cut down the previous season to clear the way. The stump was wide and flat on top, its rings visible in the pale wood, and the bark had begun to loosen at the edges. Leaning against this stump, the handle crossing the flat surface and the blade resting on the ground, was the shovel. It looked almost like a person pausing, the way the handle slanted, and the worn grip seemed to wait for a hand. The digger stopped a few paces away and looked to the shovel, then at the canal ditch just beyond it. The ditch was exactly as he had left it, the vertical face at the end of the cut showing the layered soil, the bottom swept clean, the walls straight and true. Nothing had changed overnight except that a few spiderwebs had been woven across the corners, catching the early light in threads of silk. He set his canteen and bread on the stump, next to the shovel handle, and took a moment to survey the section. The surveyors had marked this stretch with a red flag on a stake, now faded to a soft pink, and the line ran north-northeast through a patch of ground that was slightly higher than the surrounding meadow. The soil here varied, changing from one yard to the next, and he had learned to read it by the way the shovel felt when it entered the earth. The first few feet near the stump were loamy and dark, rich with decomposed leaves and old grass roots, easy to cut but prone to crumbling. Further along, the soil drew lighter in color, a brownish gray with more clay, and it held its shape better when the blade pulled it away. In one spot, A cluster of small stones lay buried just below the surface, and he knew he would need to work around them carefully, prying each one loose with patience. He picked up the shovel, taking it from the stump in the same way one might take a walking stick from a hook. The handle was ash wood, smoothed by the smith who had shaped it, and further polished by the digger's own hands over months of use. There was a spot just below the top curve where the grain of the wood felt different, tighter and darker, and it was there that the right palm always settled, as if the handle had shaped itself to the hand. The iron blade had a patina of rust at the edges where the earth had not worn it away, but the center of the blade was a dull silver grey, scratched in 1,000 fine lines that ran parallel to the digging motion. The digger turned the shovel over in his hands, feeling its weight, the balance point a few inches above the blade, and he tapped the flat of it against the stump to knock off a bit of dried mud that had escaped the previous evening's cleaning. The sound was a soft thud, absorbed by the grass and the open air. With the shovel in hand, he stepped down into the shallow trench. The bottom was cool, the soil packed firm from being walked on, and the walls rose to mid-thigh. He placed the blade against the face of the cut, the spot where the digging would resume, and he paused there, feeling the slight give of the earth through the handle. The first cut of the day was always a small one, not because the work required caution, but because there was a kind of ritual to it, a moment of alignment between the tool and the ground. He pressed down with his foot on the top edge of the blade, and the iron sank into the soil with a quiet crunch, a sound made of many tiny noises at once, the parting of root fibers, the fracture of small clods, the grinding of a few grains of sand caught between the blade and a pebble. He levered the handle back, and the shovel load broke free, a neat wedge of dark loam and pale root threads, still damp from the night's moisture. He tipped the load into the wheelbarrow and made another cut, then another, each one a small variation on the same motion. The soil here was forgiving, a soft loam that crumbled into loose crumbs as it fell, and the shovel blade sliced into it easily. But as he worked deeper along the face, the texture began to change, the color lightening from a coffee brown to a tan that held more sand. He could feel the difference through the handle before he saw it. The blade met a slight resistance, a grittier sensation that traveled up through the wood to his palm. When he lifted the shovel, the load held together less well, spilling a few grains from the sides, and the sound of the cut was a softer hiss rather than a crunch. He slowed his pace, letting the shovel do its own work at its own speed. His hands moved with a practiced ease, the right hand guiding the top of the handle and the left gripping lower down, near the collar where the blade met the shaft. He did not think about the placement of his hands. They found their spots independently, the same way his feet found the level ground without looking. The shovel blade angled slightly with each cut, tilting to follow the natural seams in the earth, and he let it, trusting the tool's shape to find the line of least resistance. Every few minutes he would stop, lean the shovel against the trench wall, and use his hands to clear the larger stones from the loosened dirt, tossing them up onto the bank with a soft thud. The morning light had grown stronger, and now it fell directly into the trench, illuminating the exposed roots and pebbles with a warm clarity. The roots were mostly fine, hair-like threads from the meadow grasses, but here and there a thicker root from a tree crossed the cut, dark and fibrous, running through the soil like a vein. The shovel blade would catch on these, and he would have to chip at them from the sides, freeing the earth around them before severing them with a firm push. The cut root smelled faintly of sap, a clean green scent that mixed with the mineral smell of the soil. The pebbles varied from small flecks of quartz that sparkled in the sun to rounded grey stones from the old riverbed, their surfaces smooth from ancient water. He collected a few of the more interesting ones automatically, not because he needed them, but because the hand sometimes took without the mind directing, and he set them on the stump next to his bread. The ditch deepened by inches, the vertical face retreating backward as he worked. He moved in a slow, steady rhythm, his breathing matched to the shovel's cycle. Inhale as the blade lifted free, exhale as it plunged back into the earth. The rest of the world receded, the distant sounds of the valley becoming a soft hum behind the nearer sound of iron meeting soil. A crow called from somewhere, and he heard it without hearing, the way one hears rain through sleep. The wheelbarrow sat waiting, already partly filled with the first loads, and when it was full he would pause to push it to the embankment. But for now he stayed within the trench, focused on the face before him. The soil texture shifted again as he moved further along the section. The sandy layer gave way to heavier clay, dark grey with a bluish tint where the moisture was trapped. Here the shovel blade cut cleanly, the clay peeling away in smooth slabs that held together without crumbling, and the sound was a low, wet schlick. The clay stuck to the blade in the thin film, building up until he had to scrape it off against the side of the wheelbarrow. The work was slower in the clay because each load was heavier, and the shovel needed a firmer press to sink in, but the satisfaction was different. The cut face left a smooth wall that looked almost polished, and the bottom of the ditch stayed level without much attention. He paused to wipe his forehead with the back of his wrist, the clay leaving a faint smear on his skin. The sun was higher now, and the heat was beginning to gather in the bottom of the trench where the air moved less. He took a drink from his canteen, the water tasting of the tin it was held in, and he stood for a moment looking at the progress he had made. The new cut extended about 2 feet further than where he had started, and the pile of excavated earth on the bank had grown noticeably. It was not a dramatic change, nothing that would catch the eye of someone passing, but it was progress nonetheless. The kind of incremental advance that, added to all the days before and all the days after, would eventually stretch from one end of the state to the other. After his short rest, he picked up the shovel again and turned his attention to a group of stones that had been partially uncovered. They were larger than the pebbles, some the size of a fist and one that was nearly the size of a melon, embedded in the clay-like seeds in a pod. He worked the shovel blade around the edges of each stone, loosening the earth that held it, and then pried with the tip until the stone popped free with a sucking sound. He lifted the melon-sized stone with both hands, its surface cold and rough, and hefted it onto the bank where it joined the others. The effort left a brief burn in his shoulders, and he stretched his arms slowly, feeling the pull of muscles that had been used all morning. The shovel itself seemed to grow warmer under the sun, the metal blade holding the heat so that it was no longer cool to the touch. The wooden handle, too, absorbed the warmth, and the grip spot became slightly tacky with a mixture of sweat and dust. He did not mind. The shovel was an extension of his own body now, and its temperature was just another piece of information, like the feel of the wind or the angle of the light. He worked on, the shovel rising and falling, the earth being lifted and moved, and the morning stretched out in a seamless thread of small, repetitive motions that carried him along without effort. At one point, the blade struck a patch of ground that was harder than the surrounding soil, a compacted layer that might have been an old animal path trampled over years. The shovel made a sharper sound, a clink, and he had to use more force to break through. When he turned the load, he saw that the earth was filled with fine gravel, the kind that would later be useful for the towpath surface, and he made a mental note to set it aside. But for now he simply lifted it into the wheelbarrow, the gravel rattling against the wooden sides, and went on. The sun continued its slow climb, and the shadows inside the trench shifted from one side to the other. The digger's hands were now coated with a fine layer of dust mixed with the clay film, and the calluses on his palms stood out pale against the darker skin. He knew the shovel's every nuance, the slight wobble in the blade where a crack had been mended, the way the handle vibrated when he hit a rock just right, the exact angle needed to get a clean cut along the wall. He did not think about these things, he simply knew them. The same way he knew that the valley would cool in the evening and the stars would appear over the eastern hills. When the wheelbarrow was full to its brim, he climbed out of the trench, the shovel resting on his shoulder, and took the handles. He pushed the load along the path, the wheel sinking slightly into the softer spots, and dumped it onto the growing embankment. The soil spread out in a fan, mixing with the loads from earlier, and he used the back of the shovel to level it slightly before returning. The walk back was a brief change of scenery, a moment when the wide valley opened up again, and he could see the other workers in their own sections, small figures moving in the same slow rhythm, the whole line of the canal coming into being inch by inch. Back at his section, he set the shovel against the stump for a moment while he took another drink and unrolled the cloth bundle. The bread was coarse and filling, and he ate it standing, his eyes resting on the ditch. The shovel waited, its blade now clean of clay, its handle catching a stripe of sunlight that ran along the grain. The earth inside the trench was dark and rich, the cut face showing a cross-section of the valley's history in horizontal bands of color, the topsoil, the sandy layer, the clay, and below that, a gravel bed that he had not yet reached. Each layer told a story of water and time, of floods and glaciers and the slow settling of the land. But the digger read them only as work, as resistance or ease, as a job that would take a certain number of hours. After the bread, he picked up the shovel again and stepped back into the trench. The afternoon was still a while off, and the morning light was now full and golden. No longer the thin grey of dawn. The blade sank into the earth once more, and the quiet crunch sounded, a small, unremarkable noise that was the truest sound of the valley, the sound of the canal being borne one shovel load at a time. The digger's hands held the handle, the smooth spot fitting the palm exactly, and the day continued in its slow, peaceful way, carrying him forward without haste toward the resting time that would come with the evening. The wheelbarrow stood near the heap of dug earth, its two wooden legs pressed into the soft ground, and its iron wheel resting in the shallow rut that it had worn for itself over many days. It was a simple tool, built by a carpenter who understood that the best designs were the ones that did their work without calling attention to themselves. The bed was made of pine boards, fitted tightly together and reinforced with two crosspieces underneath, and the grain of the wood had darkened with age and use, stained by the soil it carried and the weather it endured. The iron wheel was solid, not spoked, with a flat rim that rolled steadily over the uneven ground, and the axle was a thick rod that ran through the hub with a collar of grease made from rendered fat and wood ash. The two handles extended from the sides of the bed, curving slightly upward at the ends where the digger's hands held them, and these grips were as smooth as polished bone, shaped by the constant friction of palms. The digger had been working in the ditch for some time now, and the pile of loosened earth beside him had grown large enough to fill the barrow several times over. He straightened up, the shovel balanced in one hand, and stepped out of the trench onto the level ground. The transition from the cool shaded bottom of the ditch to the open air was always a small adjustment, the sun warmer on his shoulders and the breeze more noticeable against his damp shirt. He walked to the wheelbarrow, his boots pressing the grass flat, and turned it slightly so that its open end faced the pile. The wheel squeaked once, a short note that hung in the air, and then was gone. He lifted the first shovelful of earth from the pile, the blade heaped with the dark loam he had been cutting, and tipped it into the barrow. The soil slid off the iron with a soft rushing sound and spread across the wooden bottom. He added another shovelful, then another, each one landing with a dull thump that gradually became a muffled pat as the barrow filled. He distributed the loads evenly, placing some near the front and some near the back, so that the weight would be balanced when he lifted the handles. When the mound of earth rose above the sides, he used the flat of the shovel blade to tamp it down, pressing firmly so that nothing would spill out on the path. The soil was cool and slightly damp, and it packed together easily, holding its shape under the gentle pressure. With the barrow full, he set the shovel aside, leaning it against the stump where it would wait for his return. He took the handles in his hands, the smooth wood fitting exactly into the curves of his fingers, and he tilted the barrow forward, lifting the legs off the ground. The full weight came onto the wheel, and the axle gave its familiar low squeak as he began to push. The sound was not unpleasant, a steady, rhythmic note that repeated with each turn of the wheel, a sound so constant that it had become part of the valley's own noise, as natural as the wind in the grass or the distant murmur of the river. The path from the dig site to the embankment was a narrow track that ran alongside the canal ditch, worn into the grass by the daily passage of men and barrows. It was wide enough for one wheelbarrow at a time, and its surface was packed earth mixed with bits of gravel and crushed stems. In the morning, when the dew was heavy, the path was dark and slightly slick, but by this hour the sun had dried it to a pale tan, and the wheel left a faint line in the dust. The digger walked at a steady pace, not hurrying, his steps matching the rhythm of the wheel's squeak. The handles transmitted every small bump and dip in the path to his hands, a constant conversation between the ground and his body. On either side of the path, the meadow grass grew tall, already beginning to turn from green to gold as early summer advanced. The grass moved in the breeze, a soft rippling motion that spread across the valley in waves, and the sound it made was a dry whisper that filled the spaces between the wheelbarrow's squeaks. Wildflowers dotted the grass, small white and yellow blooms that nodded on their stems, and now and then a grasshopper would spring up from the path ahead, its wings snapping as it sailed a short distance before disappearing into the growth. The digger noticed these things without focusing on them, his eyes moving naturally across the landscape as he walked, taking in the familiar sights with a calm, untroubled attention. The embankment lay about 50 yards from the dig site, a long, low mound of earth that paralleled the canal ditch on the side away from the towpath. It was here that the excavated soil was deposited, spread in layers to form a gentle slope that would eventually be covered with grass and become part of the landscape itself. The embankment was not yet high, maybe 2 feet at its tallest point, but it stretched for hundreds of yards in either direction, the work of many diggers over many weeks, a quiet testament to the slow accumulation of small efforts. As the digger approached, he could see the fresh loads that other workers had dumped earlier, their soil slightly different in color, depending on where they had been digging, some dark and rich, others lighter and more sandy. He stopped at a spot where the embankment was still low and tilted the barrow forward, lifting the handles high so that the soil slid out in a smooth rush. The pile spread itself in a loose fan, settling against the previous loads, and the digger shook the barrow slightly to make sure nothing stuck to the bottom. Then he lowered the handles, the legs touching the ground again, and stood for a moment looking at the embankment. It was a simple thing, a pile of dirt, but it had a shape that was slowly becoming part of the valley, a new contour on the land that had not been there before. The soil from his barrow was now indistinguishable from the soil around it, merged into the larger mass, and in a few weeks grass would begin to grow on it, anchoring it in place. He turned the wheelbarrow around and began the walk back to the dig site. The empty barrow was much lighter, and he pushed it with one hand, the wheel bouncing slightly over the rougher spots. The squeak of the axle was quieter now, a softer note that did not carry as far. The return trip was always faster. A brief pause in the heavier work, and he used it to rest his shoulders and let his breathing settle. The path back offered a different view, looking toward the canal ditch and the stumps and the distant hills, and he saw his section from a slight distance, the shovel leaning against the stump and the pile of earth waiting beside the trench. Back at the site, he set the wheelbarrow in its place near the pile and picked up the shovel again. The handle was still warm from his previous grip, and the blade was clean except for a thin film of dust. He stepped into the ditch and began to fill the pile once more, the shovel rising and falling in its steady rhythm. The soil here was still the dark loam, soft and easy to cut, and the pile grew quickly, spreading out around the barrow's legs. Each shovelful was a small portion of the earth, and each barrow load was a collection of those small portions, and each trip to the embankment moved that collection from one place to another, a slow migration of soil that was measured not in hours, but in inches. When the pile was large enough, he filled the barrow again, tamping it down with the same careful motions. The weight of the full barrow was a familiar pressure against his hands, and he leaned into it slightly as he pushed, letting his body weight help the wheel turn. The path received him again, the wheels settling into the same rut, the axle beginning its low song. He walked with his eyes on the ground, just ahead of the wheel, watching for stones or roots that might catch the rim, though he knew the path so well that his feet and the wheel found their way almost without guidance. The journey to the embankment was a space of quiet, a few minutes when the shovel did not need to be held, and the muscles could shift into a different pattern of movement. At the embankment, he tilted the barrow and let the soil go. The sound of the dirt sliding out was a soft cascade, a miniature landslide that settled in a new layer on top of the previous ones. He noticed that the embankment had grown slightly since his last visit, the loads from other diggers adding their own small contributions. The whole valley was undergoing this same slow transformation, the earth being lifted from the trench and placed on the bank, the canal deepening and the embankment rising in a paired motion that was as steady as the turning of the seasons. He took a moment to scrape a bit of mud from the wheel with a stick, clearing the hub so it would turn freely, and then he started back. The pattern continued, a loop of filling and pushing and emptying and returning, each cycle much the same as the one before. The wheelbarrow was always there, waiting at the edge of the pile, and the shovel was always ready, its handle worn to the shape of the hand. The sun moved across the sky in its own slow arc, and the shadows of the wheelbarrow and the digger shortened and then began to lengthen. The temperature rose gently, not oppressively, and the air stayed fresh with a light breeze that moved through the valley. The digger did not count the loads or track the time. He simply continued, his body moving with an ease that came from long practice, his mind drifting in a calm, unfocused way. During one trip, the wheel hit a small stone that had worked its way to the surface of the path, and the barrow jolted slightly, a few crumbs of soil spilling over the side. The digger stopped, nudged the stone out of the path with his boot, and patted the spilled soil back into the barrow. The interruption was so minor that it barely registered, just a small adjustment before the rhythm resumed. The wheel resumed its squeak, and the path continued toward the embankment, and the valley remained quiet and peaceful around him. The wood of the wheelbarrow had a story that could be read in its surface. The bottom of the bed was worn thinner in the center where the weight of the earth pressed down, and the corners were rounded from being scraped against the ground when he set it down too quickly. The handles had a slight upward curve that had come from the natural bending of the wood over time, and the grips were a darker brown than the rest, polished by the oil of his skin. The iron wheel had a patch of rust near the hub where the grease did not quite reach, but the rim was bright and clean from constant contact with the soil. These details were as familiar to the digger as the lines on his own hands, and he cared for them without thinking, the same way he cared for the shovel and the canteen and the boots on his feet. As the afternoon approached, the pile at the dig site had diminished, and the embankment had received one more load among many. The ditch was deeper by another inch or two, and the wheelbarrow had travelled the same short journey 10 times, or maybe 12, each trip identical to the last. The digger paused to drink from his canteen, the water cool on his throat, and he stood near the wheelbarrow, one hand resting on the handle. The valley spread out before him, the canal cut running in its long line, the wheelbarrow tracks leading back and forth along the path, and the sky an even blue above it all. The wheelbarrow was still and quiet now, its work done for the moment, but it would be needed again soon, and the digger knew that he would return to it as naturally as he returned to his own breathing, the rhythm of the work as steady and as necessary as the rising and falling of his chest. The sun climbed higher over the Genesee Valley, and the shadow of the wheelbarrow shrank on the grass until it was just a dark pool directly beneath the wooden bed. The morning coolness had faded entirely now, replaced by a gentle warmth that settled over the landscape like a soft blanket. The breeze that had moved through the grass earlier had stilled, and the air was calm and clear, carrying the dry scent of sun-warmed earth. It was the middle of the day, that long stretch when time seemed to slow and the light became almost stationary, and the digger worked on in his section of the canal with a pace that had no hurry in it. He had been at the work for several hours now, and his body had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as walking or breathing. The shovel lifted and turned, the blade sank into the earth, the load tipped into the wheelbarrow, and the barrow waited to be filled. There was no need to think about any of it anymore. His muscles knew the sequence, and they carried it out with a quiet efficiency that required no direction from his mind. His thoughts drifted elsewhere, touching on small things, the taste of the bread he had eaten, the pattern of the clouds that had passed earlier, the sound of the river in the distance. None of these thoughts stayed long. They came and went like the breeze, leaving no trace behind. The physical feeling of the work had become a kind of low hum in his body, a constant presence that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply there. His shoulders moved with a smooth circular motion, the right shoulder lifting as the shovel blade came up, the left shoulder pressing forward as the blade went down. His back straightened and bent in a slow rhythm, and his legs shifted his weight from one foot to the other with each cut. There was a warmth in his muscles now, a looseness that came from hours of steady use, and the stiffness of the morning was a distant memory. The callus on his right thumb, the one that had built up over months of gripping the shovel handle, was a pale, tough pad that he could feel pressing against the wood with each lift. It was the same on his left hand, though slightly smaller, and together they formed a kind of natural glove that protected the softer skin beneath. Sweat gathered at his hairline, not in drops but in a fine sheen that caught the light when he turned his head. It was the kind of sweat that came from steady, unhurried effort rather than from strain, and it cooled his skin slightly whenever a small breath of air moved past. He would wipe his forehead now and then with the sleeve of his shirt, a gesture so automatic that he did not notice doing it. The fabric of the shirt was damp across his back and under his arms, but it dried quickly in the open air, between the times he was in the trench and the times he was pushing the wheelbarrow along the path. The shovel blade continued its work, sinking into the earth with that familiar soft crunch. The soil here was still the dark loam, but it was drier now than it had been in the early morning, the moisture drawn out by the sun. The texture was lighter, more crumbly, and the loads that he lifted were slightly less heavy. The sound of the cut was a little sharper too, a crisper noise that spoke of dry roots and loose particles. He adjusted his angle without thinking, tilting the blade just a fraction more to get a cleaner slice, and the shovel responded as if it understood what was needed. When the pile of loosened earth had grown large enough, he climbed out of the trench and filled the wheelbarrow, tamping the load down with the flat of the shovel. The wheelbarrow was warm to the touch now, the wood having absorbed the sun's heat, and the iron wheel was almost hot where the direct light fell on it. He took the handles and pushed the load along the path, the wheel squeaking steadily, a sound that had become so familiar that it was like a song he had known all his life. The walk to the embankment was a slight change in the pattern, a shift from the vertical motion of digging to the horizontal motion of pushing, and his body welcomed the variation. At the embankment, he tilted the barrow and let the soil slide out. The pile here had grown noticeably since the morning, and the contour of the embankment was beginning to take on a more definite shape, a long, low ridge that ran parallel to the canal cut. He stood for a moment, catching his breath though he was not out of breath, and looked across the valley. The other workers were small figures in the distance, some in their own sections of the ditch, others pushing their own barrows along the path. They moved in the same slow rhythm, their shovels rising and falling, their barrows rolling back and forth, and the whole valley seemed to be engaged in a single shared motion, a quiet dance that had been going on for weeks and would continue for weeks more. He turned the barrow and started back, the empty wheel bouncing slightly over the packed earth. The return trip was a small rest, a few minutes when the shovel did not need to be lifted and the earth did not need to be cut. He let his arms hang loosely, his hands resting lightly on the handles, and he breathed deeply, taking in the warm air and the smell of dry grass. The path back to his section was as familiar as the lines on his palms, and his feet found their way without his eyes needing to guide them. Back at the dig site, he set the wheelbarrow in its place and picked up the shovel again. The handle was warm, almost hot where the sun had been on it, and he gripped it with a sense of homecoming. The ditch waited for him, its walls straight and its bottom level, and he stepped down into it with the ease of long habit. The dirt at the bottom was packed firm from his boots, and he positioned himself facing the cut face, the shovel blade resting on the ground before him. He pressed down with his foot, the blade sank in, the handle levered back, and the cycle began again. The afternoon light was different from the morning light, not just in its angle, but in its quality. The morning light had been fresh and new, full of promise, while the afternoon light was steadier, more golden, a light that seemed to have settled into the landscape and made itself at home. It fell across the valley in long, warm bands, picking out the details of the grass and the trees and the distant hills with a gentle clarity. The shadows were softer now, their edges blurred slightly, and the colors of the earth and the vegetation had deepened, the greens becoming richer and the browns taking on a reddish tint. The digger worked on through this light, his body moving in its steady rhythm, his mind drifting peacefully. He noticed the small things around him, a beetle crawling across the top of the trench wall, its shell a dark, polished brown, the way the soil changed color slightly when it was freshly cut, darker and more moist than the surface, the pattern of the roots that ran through the earth like fine veins, some of them pale and some of them dark, each one a tiny piece of the meadow's life. These details passed through his awareness without sticking, small observations that added texture to the hours without demanding attention. His thirst grew gradually, a dry feeling at the back of his throat that reminded him to pause. He climbed out of the trench and walked to the stump where his canteen sat in the shade. The canteen was a simple tin container with a cork stopper, and the water inside was still cool from the morning's filling. He pulled the cork and drank, the water tasting of the tin and of the creek it had come from, a clean mineral flavor that was refreshing without being cold. He drank slowly, letting the water sit in his mouth for a moment before swallowing, and he poured a little onto his hand and wiped it across the back of his neck, the moisture cool against his skin. Then he stopped at the canteen and set it back on the stump, and he stood for a while looking out at the valley. From this spot, he could see the full sweep of the canal line as it curved through the meadow and disappeared behind a stand of trees to the east. The ditch was a dark line cut into the green and gold of the grass, and the embankment was a paler line beside it. And the path where the wheelbarrows travelled was a thin thread connecting the two. Other workers were visible here and there, their forms small and distant, their movements slow and indistinct. A wagon was moving along a track on the far side of the valley, its wheels raising a faint trail of dust. And somewhere beyond the hills, a thin column of smoke rose from a chimney that was too far to see. The whole landscape was peaceful, a picture of quiet industry, and the digger felt himself to be a small part of it, no more and no less than the grass or the trees or the stones in the soil. After his rest, he returned to the ditch and took up the shovel. The handle fit his hands as it always did, the smooth spot meeting his right palm exactly. He noticed that the callus on his thumb was slightly flattened from the pressure, and he rubbed it absently against the wood before beginning again. The shovel blade found the earth, and the earth gave way, and the work continued. The sun moved a little further across the sky, and the shadows stretched a little longer, and the pile of dug earth grew a little higher. Time passed in its quiet way, not measured, but felt, a slow current that carried the day along without haste. The digger's body was fully warm now, a pleasant heat that suffused his limbs and made his movements fluid and easy. His breathing was deep and regular, his heart beating with a slow, steady pulse that matched the rhythm of the shovel. He could feel the shifting weight of his body as he worked, the way his hips moved to counterbalance the load, the way his knees bent and straightened with each cut. It was a kind of music, this movement, a physical melody that played on without a conductor, and he was both the instrument and the player, the shovel, an extension of his arms that translated his effort into the language of the earth. The wheelbarrow filled and was emptied, the cycle repeating with the regularity of a tide. The path received the wheel's track again and again, the same line deepening slightly each time. The embankment grew by another inch, and the ditch deepened by another inch, and the day moved on. The digger did not tire in the way one tires from a sprint or a heavy lift. Instead, a gentle fatigue began to settle into his muscles, a comfortable heaviness that reminded him of the work he had done without weighing him down. It was the kind of tiredness that would make the evening rest all the sweeter, a feeling of earned stillness that was still a few hours away. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to take on the first hints of evening, though the sun was still well above the hills. The gold in the air deepened slightly, and the shadows grew more distinct, their edges sharper now than they had been at noon. The breeze returned, a light movement of air that came from the west and carried the cooler breath of the distant forests. The digger paused to feel it on his face, his eyes half closed, and he let the wind dry the sweat on his skin. The valley was quiet except for the distant sounds of work and the nearer sounds of birds, and the peace of the late afternoon was a tangible thing, a calm that wrapped around him like the fading warmth of the day. The sun stood directly overhead, and the shadows had vanished almost entirely, retreating to small dark pools directly beneath the wheelbarrow, the stump, and the digger's own boots. The heat was a gentle pressure, not the heavy oppressive heat of late summer, but a milder warmth that belonged to the early weeks of the season, a warmth that settled on the skin and stayed there without becoming uncomfortable. The air was still now, the breeze having faded away some time in the last hour, and the grass stood motionless, each blade a thin line of gold-green in the midday light. Even the birds had quieted, retreating to the shade of the woods to wait out the warmest part of the day. The digger had been working steadily through the late morning, and the section of ditch had deepened by another few inches. The pile of excavated earth beside the trench had grown and been carted away several times, and the wheelbarrow stood now with a partial load, its bed half full of the darker soil from the lower part of the cut. But the sun's position told him what his body already knew. It was time to rest. There was no bell that rang, no overseer who called the halt, only the natural rhythm of the day that had been followed by workers. For as long as there had been work, the midday pause was a quiet custom, as much a part of the canal's construction as the digging itself. He straightened up slowly, the shovel resting across his shoulder, and took a last look at the cut face. It was clean and even, the layers of soil showing in their bands of brown and tan and grey. He had done enough for the morning. The afternoon would bring its own share of work, but for now the shovel could rest, and so could he. He stepped out of the trench, his boots pressing into the loose dirt of the bank, and walked to the stump where his tools waited to be put aside. The shovel he placed carefully, pressing the blade into the loose earth so that it stood upright, the handle rising like a thin tree trunk from the ground. It was an old habit, a way of keeping the handle clean and the blade from dulling against stones. But it was also a small act of order, a putting of things in their proper place before the rest began. The wheelbarrow he parked under the partial shade of the tall maple that stood near the work line, tilting it forward so that the load would not shift and the bed would be level. The shade of the maple was not deep, but it was enough, a dappled pattern of light and dark that moved slightly as the high leaves stirred in the faintest breath of air. The maple was an old tree, one of the few that had been left standing when the canal line was cleared. Its trunk was thick and rough, the bark a dark grey that was deeply furrowed, and its branches spread wide, casting a circle of shade that covered a good patch of grass. The ground beneath it was worn smooth from use, the grass flattened but still soft, and a few exposed roots made natural seats near the base. The digger had taken his rest here many times, and the spot had become familiar, a small sanctuary in the middle of the working day. He took the cloth bundle from the stump where he had left it, along with his canteen, and carried them to the base of the maple. He sat down on the grass, his back against the rough trunk, and let out a long breath that he had not realized he had been holding. The transition from standing and lifting to sitting and resting was a small kind of release, a letting go of the tension that had been quietly building in his muscles through the morning. He stretched his legs out in front of him, the grass cool against the back of his boots, and he leaned his head back against the bark, looking up at the canopy of leaves above. The leaves were a deep green, their edges sharply defined against the blue-white sky, and they rustled softly with the tiny movements of air that barely reached the ground. Shafts of sunlight broke through the gaps in the foliage, falling in warm spots on his trousers and on the grass around him, and the contrast between the sunspots and the shade was pleasant, a patchwork of light and cool that shifted slowly as the branches moved. He closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and listened to the quiet. The valley was almost silent now, the other workers also at their rest, and the only sounds were the faint whisper of the leaves and the distant, steady murmur of the Genesee River. After a while, he opened his eyes and reached for the cloth bundle. He unwrapped it slowly, the fabric soft and warm from many such unwrappings, and laid the contents on his knee. There was a thick piece of dark bread, its crust cracked and flour-dusted, and a wedge of hard cheese that had begun to soften slightly at the edges from the warmth of the day. There was also a small withered apple that he had been saving, its skin wrinkled but still firm. It was a simple meal, the same meal he ate most days, but it was enough, and the act of eating it in the shade was a quiet pleasure. He broke off a piece of the bread and chewed it slowly, the texture dense and slightly sour on his tongue. The cheese was sharp and salty, and he cut a slice with the small knife he carried in his pocket, laying it on the bread and taking a bite that combined the two flavors. He ate without hurry, each mouthful chewed thoroughly, his eyes resting on the middle distance where the canal cut ran through the meadow. A few crows called from the woods to the south, their voices carrying clearly in the still air, and somewhere far off a cow lowed, a sound so distant that it was almost imagined. The canteen sat beside him, and he took it up now and then, drinking the water that was still faintly cool. The tin cup of the canteen was dented on one side from a long-ago fall, but it held the water the same, and he drank from it without thinking about the dent or the history behind it. The water washed the taste of the bread and cheese from his mouth and left a clean, mineral flavor that reminded him of the creek where he had filled it that morning. The creek was a small one, shallow and clear, running over a bed of round stones, and the water there was always cold, even on warm days, shaded by the alders that grew along its banks. He ate the apple last, biting into it with a crisp sound that was loud in the quiet. The flesh was slightly mealy, but still sweet, and he ate it down to the core, then tossed the core into the grass where some small animal would find it before morning. He wiped his hands on his trousers and rested them on his stomach, feeling the fullness of the simple meal settle inside him. The shade of the maple was deep and cool, and the trunk was solid against his back, and for a while he simply sat, his eyes half closed, listening to nothing in particular. The rest was not sleep, not yet, but it was an easing of attention, a loosening of the hold that wakefulness had on his mind. His thoughts became loose and scattered, drifting across the surface of his awareness like the thin clouds that were beginning to appear high above the valley. He thought about the creek and the alders, about the way the water sounded when it ran over the stones. He thought about the section of ditch and the gravel layer that he would reach tomorrow or the day after. He thought about the smith who had made his shovel, a man with a crooked nose and a quiet voice who had handed him the tool and said simply, "It will do the work." None of these thoughts were urgent. They came and went without effort, like the slow turning of the leaves above him. The maple's shade moved almost imperceptibly as the sun shifted slightly in the sky, the patches of light sliding across the grass in a slow migration. A small brown ant crawled across his boot, pausing at the laces as if considering a crossing, then continued on its way and vanished into the grass. The digger watched it go, his eyes following the tiny movement without curiosity, simply observing. The ant had its own work to do, its own loads to carry, and it moved with the same steady purpose that the digger moved with, though on a scale so much smaller that the two could never meet. The silence of the midday valley was a deep and peaceful thing. It was not an absolute silence, for the river still murmured, and the crows still called, and the leaves still rustled. But it was a silence of human sounds, a pause in the labor that filled all the other hours. In this pause, the valley seemed to breathe, to rest in its own way, the grass and the trees and the earth all settling into a quiet stillness that matched the stillness of the workers under their scattered trees. The canal cut itself seemed to rest, the dark line of the ditch holding no movement, the embankment still and solid, the wheelbarrows and shovels all parked and waiting. The digger shifted slightly against the tree trunk, finding a more comfortable position. The grass beneath him was thick and soft, and the ground was warm from the sun that had fallen on it earlier. He could feel the heat of the day pressing down from above, but the shade held it at bay, and the air around him was cool enough to be pleasant. He thought about stretching out fully on the grass, letting his head rest on the root that curved up from the ground like a low pillow, but he remained sitting, his back against the bark, his hands loose in his lap. The rest was exactly what it needed to be, neither too long nor too short, a natural pause in the rhythm of the day. Time moved differently during the rest, not measured by the progress of the work, but by the slow drift of the clouds and the gradual movement of the sun. The digger did not count the minutes, he simply sat, and the sitting was enough. His breathing slowed and deepened, and his heart beat with a calm, steady pulse that was slower than it had been while he worked. The muscles in his shoulders and back relaxed gradually, the warmth of the meal and the stillness of the shade working together to ease the tension that the morning had built. He was not tired in the way that comes from lack of sleep, but he was ready for rest, and the rest came to him as naturally as the shade came from the tree. After a while, he opened his eyes fully and looked out at the valley. The light had changed slightly, the gold of noon beginning to take on the first hint of the afternoon's amber. The shadows were just starting to reappear, thin and tentative, stretching a few inches from the base of the wheelbarrow and the stump. It was not yet time to rise, but the moment of deepest rest had passed, and his mind was beginning to stir again, to notice the work that waited. He did not hurry toward it. He let the awareness come slowly, like the light itself, and he sat for a little while longer, enjoying the last minutes of the pause. The crows called again from the woods, and this time he answered them silently with a turn of his head, watching their dark shapes lift from the trees and circle once before settling again. The river in the distance sent up its steady murmur, and the leaves above him rustled in a new breath of air, a little stronger than before, a breeze that was beginning to stir as the afternoon approached. The digger took a last drink from his canteen, the water now fully warmed to the temperature of the day, and he stoppered it and set it aside. He folded the empty cloth and tucked it into his pocket, and he sat forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes taking in the canal cut and the shovel and the wheelbarrow. The rest was ending, but it did not end sharply, no more than the morning had ended or the afternoon would end. It simply faded, like the shade fading as the sun moved, and the digger found himself ready to stand, ready to take up the shovel again, ready to resume the steady motion of the day. The maple had given its shade, and the bread and cheese had given their nourishment, and the quiet had given its peace, and all of these things had done their work as surely as the shovel did its own. He stood up slowly, brushing a few bits of grass from his trousers, and walked out of the shade into the warm sunlight. The rest already becoming a memory, a quiet space in the middle of the day that would come again tomorrow. The afternoon earth was different from the morning earth, a change that came not suddenly but gradually as the sun drew the night's moisture up through the soil and into the warm air. The digger noticed it first in the way the shovel blade entered the ground, the resistance a little less, the sound a little softer. Where the morning cuts had made a crisp crunch, the afternoon cuts made a gentle scrape, a sound like a hand brushing across dry sand. The soil itself was lighter in color now, the dark loam having dried to a warm brown, and the clods he lifted broke apart more easily, crumbling into loose crumbs that spilled from the sides of the shovel blade as he turned it toward the wheelbarrow. He was working along a new stretch of the line now, a section he had not touched before. The survey stakes here were older than the ones near the maple stump, their wood weathered to a silvery grey, and the strips of red cloth tied to their tops had faded to a soft pink, almost the color of the inside of a shell. The stakes marched in a straight line across the meadow, each one spaced about 50 feet from the next, marking the intended course of the canal with a quiet authority. The digger did not need to consult them often. The ditch itself was the true guide now, its dark line cutting cleanly through the grass, but the stakes were a reminder that the work was part of something larger than his own section, a plan that had been drawn on paper by men he would never meet. The ditch here was about 3 feet deep, and the sides were straight and true, the work of the diggers who had come before him. They had cut down through the topsoil and the sandy layer, and were now well into the clay, leaving a channel that was exactly as wide at the bottom as it was at the top. The walls had been trimmed clean, the shovel marks visible in long parallel lines that ran vertically down the face like the grain of a piece of wood. The digger's task was to deepen this section further, taking the bottom down another few inches so that it matched the grade that the surveyors had calculated. The grade was a gentle slope that would carry water from the high ground in the east to the lower valley in the west, a drop so slight that it was almost invisible, yet it was the reason for every shovelful of earth that was moved. He stepped down into the ditch, the bottom here firmer than the loamy sections he had worked in the morning. The clay made a solid floor under his boots, slightly sticky where the moisture still lingered, and it held his weight without giving way. He positioned himself facing the end of the section where the bottom sloped up to meet the uncut ground, and he began to work the shovel blade into the clay. The blade made a sucking sound as it pulled free, a wet pot that was different from the scrape of the drier soil above, and the loads he lifted were heavier, the clay clinging to the iron in a dense, sticky mass. He had to tap the blade against the side of the wheelbarrow to dislodge it, the clay falling away in a thick slab that landed with a dull thud. As he worked, he paid attention to the walls of the ditch, which needed occasional trimming to keep them straight. The shovel edge served as a kind of plane, slicing away the loose clods that had begun to separate from the face. He would run the blade down the wall in a smooth, vertical stroke, the iron scraping against the clay with a sound like a knife on a whetstone, and the clods would fall away, leaving a clean surface behind. The trimmed pieces were small, no larger than his fist, and he gathered them into the shovel and added them to the growing pile. The walls of the ditch were important. If they were not kept true, they could slump inward over time, filling the channel with loose earth, and so the trimming was not extra work, but essential work, a part of the digging that ensured the canal would hold its shape when the water finally came. The wheelbarrow waited nearby, its bed already half full with the heavier clay. The iron wheel had sunk slightly into the softened ground at the edge of the ditch, and a thin crust of dried mud clung to the rim. The digger added shovelful after shovelful, the pile in the barrow rising slowly, and when it was full he tamped it down with the flat of the blade, pressing the sticky clay into a compact load that would not shift. He took the handles and pushed, and the wheel came free from the mud with a small sucking sound, then began to roll along the path with its familiar low squeak. The path to the embankment was drier now than it had been in the morning, the packed earth baked to a pale tan by the afternoon sun. Dust rose in small puffs from the wheel, hanging in the air for a moment before settling, and the digger could feel the grit of it on his hands and on his face. The air was still warm, but not hot, and it carried the smell of dry grass and exposed roots, a scent that was like hay, but sharper, with an earthy undertone that came from the clay and the stones. As he walked, he noticed the way the lights had begun to change, the angle of the sun shifting from directly overhead to a slant that came from the west. The shadows that had been small and dark were now lengthening, stretching out from the base of every tree and every stake, and his own shadow walked beside the wheelbarrow, long and thin, its outline blurred slightly by the dust. At the embankment, he tilted the barrow and let the clay slide out. It fell in a solid mass rather than a loose fan, the sticky material holding its shape until it hit the pile, where it slowly slumped into a rounded mound. He used the back of the shovel to spread it slightly, blending it with the previous loads, and then he stood for a moment, letting the breeze that had begun to stir cool the sweat on his forehead. The embankment here was higher than the section he had worked earlier in the day, the result of many days of digging, and it rose from the meadow like a long, low wall, its surface already beginning to sprout the first green shoots of grass that had taken root in the disturbed soil. He turned the barrow and began the walk back, the empty bed rattling slightly over the rougher spots in the path. The return trip was a small rest, a few minutes when he could straighten his back and let his arms hang loose, his hands resting lightly on the handles. The valley spread out before him, the canal cut running in its long curve, the survey stakes marking the future line, and the distant hills a soft blue-grey against the paler sky. The light was golden now, that rich afternoon light that seemed to settle over everything like a fine dust, and it coloured the exposed earth of the ditch a deeper brown and the grass a brighter gold. Even the dust that hung in the air caught the light and glowed, a faint haze that softened the edges of the distant trees. Back at his section, he set the wheelbarrow in its place and climbed down into the ditch again. The shovel was where he had left it, leaning against the wall, and he picked it up and resumed the work. The clay was still heavy, but he had found the rhythm of it now, the way the blade needed a firmer press to sink in and a sharper pull to break free. His body moved with the same steady pace as before, his shoulders rising and falling, his back bending and straightening, his feet shifting in the clay. The afternoon heat was a mild presence, not oppressive, and the breeze that came in occasional gusts was cool enough to keep him from feeling overheated. He worked on, the shovels scraping and sucking, the barrow filling and emptying, and the ditch deepening by another fraction of an inch with each cut. The survey stakes stood in their silent line, their faded red cloths fluttering slightly in the breeze. They were a reminder that this work was not random, that every inch of depth and every degree of slope had been measured and recorded, but to the digger they were simply markers, familiar landmarks in the landscape of his labour. He knew the stake at the far end of his section by the way it leaned slightly to the left, and the stake at the near end by the split in its top where a surveyor's hammer had struck it. He worked between them, moving from one to the other over the course of many days, the space between them growing deeper and cleaner with each passing hour. The walls of the ditch needed trimming again, a small section near the top where the sandy layer met the clay. The sand here was drier and looser, and it had a tendency to crumble away from the face, leaving a slight overhang of the clay above. He used the edge of the shovel to scrape the overhang back, the iron blade biting into the clay and cutting it away in thin slices. The slices fell to the bottom of the ditch with soft thuds, and he gathered them up and added them to the barrow. The wall now was smooth and vertical, the layers of soil showing in their distinct bands, a record of the valley's geology laid bare by the work of his hands. As the afternoon turned further toward evening, the light continued to change, the gold deepening into amber, and the shadows stretched even longer across the meadow. The digger's shadow, when he stood on the bank, reached eastward for many feet, a thin, dark shape that moved with him as he walked. The air began to cool slightly, the first hint of the evening's approach, and the smell of the dry grass grew stronger, mixed now with the scent of the minerals in the clay and the faint, clean odor of the creek that ran somewhere nearby. The birds that had been quiet during the heat of the day began to stir again, their calls ringing out from the woods in short, tentative notes that would build into the fuller chorus of the evening. The digger paused in his work and straightened up, the shovel resting across his shoulder. He looked out at the valley and saw that the other workers were also slowing, their movements becoming more measured as the day wound down. The line of the canal was a dark stripe across the meadow, and the embankment was a paler stripe beside it, and the two lines curved together like the rails of a cart track, running off into the distance where they disappeared among the trees. The light on the hills was soft and hazy, and the sky above them was turning from blue to a pale, washed-out gold that would soon deepen into orange and pink. He climbed out of the ditch and set the shovel aside, his hands automatically reaching for the wheelbarrow. The load was only half full, but he decided to take it to the embankment anyway, a last trip before the evening rest. He pushed the barrow along the path, the wheels squeaking steadily, and the dust rose around him in a fine golden cloud that caught the low-angled light. The walk was quiet, the only sounds the creak of the wheel and the distant calls of the birds and the soft whisper of the breeze in the grass. At the embankment, he tipped the load and watched it slide down, the clay mixing with the earlier deposits to form another small layer in the slow-growing mound. He stood there for a moment, the empty barrow in his hands, and looked back at the section he had worked. The ditch was a dark straight line cut into the meadow, its bottom now a little deeper, its walls a little cleaner. It was a small change, almost invisible in the vastness of the valley, but it was a change nonetheless, a record of the afternoon's labor that would be continued tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. The wheelbarrow was warm from the sun, the wood holding the heat of the late afternoon, and the iron wheel was hot to the touch, where the direct light had fallen on it. The digger turned the barrow around and began the walk back, his shadow now so long that it seemed to precede him, a dark guide leading the way eastward toward the coming night. When he returned to the section, he did not climb back into the ditch. The light was softening now, the sun just above the line of the western hills, and the day's work was drawing to its natural close. He parked the wheelbarrow near the stump and took up the shovel, but not to dig. Instead, he began the small, careful ritual of cleaning the tools, the same ritual that marked the end of every working day. The shovel blade was coated with a thick layer of dried clay, and he scraped it off with a flat stone, working the edge of the stone along the iron until the metal showed through, dark and dull. He wiped the handle with a handful of dry grass, removing the grit and the sweat, and he checked the wedge at the top to make sure it was still tight. The wheelbarrow he brushed clean with a bundle of twigs, sweeping the loose dirt from the bed and the frame, and he picked a few bits of gravel from the hub of the wheel. The tools were ready for the morning, and he was ready for the evening, the transition from work to rest as smooth and as natural as the changing of the light. The shadows had now lengthened so far that they had merged into a single darkness that covered the eastern side of the valley, and the light on the western hills was a brilliant gold that was beginning to fade at the edges. The air was cool now, a noticeable drop from the warmth of the afternoon, and the digger felt it on his skin as he walked away from the ditch toward the camp. The shovel was on his shoulder, the wheelbarrow was clean and still, and the day was over. The afternoon soil had been moved, the walls had been trimmed, and the canal was a little deeper, a little closer to its completion. But the completion was still far off. A distant event belonged to another season, and for now the only thing that mattered was the quiet of the evening and the rest that was coming. From where the digger worked, the arc of the canal cut could be seen curving gently through the valley floor, a long, deliberate sweep that began somewhere far to the east and disappeared behind a rise of land to the west. It was not a straight line, not a rigid slash like a surveyor's mark on paper, but a considered curve that followed the natural contours of the ground, bending where the land bent, rising slightly where the ground rose, falling away where the valley dipped toward the river. The engineers had laid it out with their levels and chains 2 summers before, walking the valley in a slow, methodical progress, driving stakes and tying red flags, translating the landscape into numbers and the numbers into a path, and what had once been an idea on a map was now a visible shape carved into the earth. The digger had stepped out of the ditch to stretch his back, the shovel resting across his shoulder, and he stood on the low bank looking out at the work that surrounded him. The pause was a small one, a moment of stillness in the long afternoon, and he used it to let his eyes travel over the familiar landscape, seeing it not as a series of tasks, but as a whole, a single unfolding picture. The valley was wide here, the Genesee having cut a broad floodplain over thousands of years, and the canal line ran along the southern edge of this plain, keeping above the river's reach while staying as level as possible. The grass on either side of the cut had been trampled by many feet, and a network of narrow paths crossed the meadow, connecting the ditch to the embankment to the camp to the creek that ran along the far side of the valley. The strips of cleared land were visible in both directions. The result of the previous season's work when crews had come through with axes and saws to remove the trees and brush. The stumps of the larger trees still dotted the meadow, their wide bases grey and weathered, some already sprouting clusters of pale shoots. The smaller stumps had been grubbed out, their roots pulled from the earth with teams of oxen, and the ground where they had been was now smooth, covered with a fresh growth of clover and timothy that had been seeded to hold the soil. The cleared strip was about 60 feet wide, a corridor of open ground that would allow the canal and the towpath to sit side by side. And beyond this corridor, the natural woods began, a dark line of oaks and maples that marked the boundary of the cultivated space. Along the north side of the canal cut, the piles of excavated earth formed a long, continuous ridge that would eventually become the towpath. This ridge was not yet finished. It was still uneven in places, higher where the ditch was deep and lower where the natural ground had been closer to the final grade. But its shape was already clear. The diggers' own loads had contributed to it, as had the loads of the other men working along this stretch, and the ridge represented the accumulated effort of many weeks, the slow transformation of the ditch into a path. When the canal was finished, mules or horses would walk along this path, pulling the barges with their long ropes, but for now it was simply a long pile of dirt, its surface marked with the tracks of wheelbarrows and the footprints of men. On the far side of the towpath ridge, about a quarter of a mile away, the distant line of trees along the creek formed a dark green ribbon that wound through the valley floor. The creek was a tributary of the Genesee, a small winding stream that had cut its own narrow valley over the centuries, and its banks were thick with alders and willows, their leaves a lighter green than the oaks of the higher ground. The digger could not see the water from where he stood, but he knew it was there, a cool thread running over a bed of round stones. The same creek where he filled his canteen in the mornings. The sound of it did not carry this far, but the sight of the trees was enough, a marker of water in the dry summer landscape. Beyond the creek, the land began to rise, a series of gentle slopes that climbed toward the blue-gray silhouette of the far hills. Those hills were the rim of the Genesee Valley, the ancient walls of a much larger river that had flowed in a different age, and they stood against the sky in a soft, hazy outline, their details blurred by the distance. In the morning the hills were often veiled in mist, and in the evening they caught the last light, turning a deep purple before the dark took them. Now, in the late afternoon, they were a quiet presence, a background to the valley's work, their slopes covered with a patchwork of fields and woods that were too far to distinguish individually. The digger's eyes moved slowly over this scene, taking in the canal cut that curved away from him, the towpath ridge that paralleled it, the creek that ran beyond, and the hills that held the valley in their long embrace. He saw the other workers, too, small figures in their own sections of the ditch, their shovels moving in the same steady rhythm as his own. Some were close enough that he could hear the faint scrape of their blades, and others were so far that they were only specks of movement against the brown of the earth. Between them, the wheelbarrows travelled back and forth along the paths, small wooden shapes that creaked and squeaked as they went. The whole line of the canal, as far as he could see in either direction, was alive with this quiet activity, a slow, collective labour that had been going on for months and would go on for many months more. He thought in a vague and unfocused way about the scale of the work, about the many men over many weeks who were turning a line on paper into a channel in the ground. The line on paper had been drawn in Albany, in a room with maps and charts, by men who had never walked this valley, who had never felt the soil under their boots or heard the creek running over the stones. They had imagined the canal as a single continuous thread, a ribbon of water that would connect the Hudson to the lake, and they had sent their surveyors out to mark the path. Those surveyors had walked every foot of the route, driving stakes and making notes, and now the diggers were following those stakes, making the line real. The digger did not think of it in grand terms. It was simply his daily work, the same work that the other men were doing in their own sections. But standing here on the bank, seeing the whole sweep of the canal, he had a quiet sense of being part of something large and slow, something that moved at the pace of the seasons rather than the pace of a single day. Nothing about the work was sudden. The canal grew by inches, not by feet, and each inch was the result of 1,000 shovelfuls, 100 barrow loads, a dozen trips along the path. The transformation of the valley was so gradual that it was almost invisible from one day to the next, and the digger, who saw it every day, could only mark the progress by the changing depth of his section and the changing height of the embankment. But in his memory, the valley had changed greatly since the first day he had arrived, when the canal line was just a line of stakes and flags and the ground was unbroken meadow. Now there was a ditch and a towpath ridge and a cleared corridor, and the shape of the canal was unmistakable, a channel waiting for water. The water would come later, from the east, where the canal would connect to the Mohawk River, and beyond that to the Hudson. It would flow slowly, pulled by the gentle gradient that the surveyors had calculated, and it would fill the ditch from bank to bank, turning the dry earth into a mirror of the sky. Boats would travel on it carrying grain and lumber and people, and the towpath would come alive with the footsteps of mules and the calls of the boatmen, but that future was still far off, a distant season that might be a year away or more. And for now only the shape was here, the empty channel, the bare earth, the silent towpath. The digger did not think much about that future. It was too remote, too abstract, like a story told around the fire. His concern was the soil under his shovel, the barrow load that needed moving, the wall that needed trimming. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, feeling the pleasant ache in his shoulders and his back, the evidence of the work he had done. The stretch had loosened the tightness in his spine, and he rolled his shoulders once, twice, before letting the shovel slide down from his shoulder into his hands. The handle was worn from the sun, smooth and familiar, and the blade was still clean from the trimming he had done earlier. He looked at the section of ditch before him, the dark walls and the level bottom, and he saw the places where he would work next. The uneven spots that needed attention, the layer of gravel that was beginning to appear near the far end. He spat on his hands, a quick, automatic gesture, and rubbed them together, the moisture mixing with the fine dust that coated his palms. The grip on the shovel handle would be firmer now, the slight tackiness of the damp skin helping to hold the wood. He stepped back down into the ditch, his boots finding the familiar firmness of the clay bottom, and he positioned himself facing the cut face where the soil was still untouched. The walls of the ditch rose around him, warm and close, and the sky above was a narrow strip of blue that framed the tops of the grass and the distant hills. He could no longer see the full sweep of the valley from down here, only the section of earth directly before him, but the wider view was still in his mind, a memory of the shape and the scale of the work. He set the shovel blade against the base of the cut face and pressed down with his foot. The soil gave way with a soft, dry crunch, and the blade sank in. He levered the handle back, the load breaking free, and he turned and tipped it into the wheelbarrow that waited nearby. The motion was as familiar as breathing, and his body settled back into the rhythm without effort. The shovel rose and fell, the barrow filled, and the work continued. A small, steady progress that would add another inch to the depth of the canal and another load to the towpath ridge. The valley remained quiet around him, the other workers moving in their own distant rhythms, the creek flowing unseen behind its screen of trees, and the hills standing in their ancient silence under the deepening sky. The afternoon light continued its slow change, the gold deepening into a richer amber, and the shadows of the survey stakes grew longer across the grass. The digger worked on, his mind drifting in the calm space between thoughts, his body moving with the quiet certainty of long practice. The canal cut curved through the valley, the towpath ridge rose beside it, and far away the Genesee River ran its own course, a separate water that would one day be crossed by the canal on an aqueduct of stone. But all of that was still to come, a future of water and boats and commerce that lay just beyond the horizon of the present season. And for now there was only the ditch and the shovel and the slow, peaceful rhythm of the man who dug it. When the sun was just above the western ridge, its lower edge already touching the dark line of the hills, the digger finished the last load of the day. The shovel blade sank into the clay one final time, the sound a soft, wet sigh, and he lifted the earth with a motion that was slower than it had been at noon, his arms moving through the golden light with a kind of tired grace. He tipped the load into the wheelbarrow, the clay landing with a dull thud against the other loads, and then he straightened up and stood for a moment in the bottom of the ditch, the shovel resting across his shoulder, his breathing slow and deep. The work was done, The section deepened by another small measure, and the evening light was filling the valley with a warm amber glow that signaled the close of the day. He climbed out of the trench, his boots finding the familiar footholds in the clay wall, and he stood on the bank beside the wheelbarrow. The barrow was full, the last load of the afternoon, and he took the handles and pushed it along the path toward the embankment. The wheel squeaked steadily, a sound that had been with him all day and would soon be silent. The path was cool now, the sun's heat fading from the packed earth, and the dust did not rise as it had in the afternoon. Instead, the wheel left a clean track in the soil, a thin line that would be erased by the dew before morning. At the embankment, he tilted the barrow and let the clay slide out, spreading it with the back of the shovel, so that it blended with the earlier loads, and then he turned the barrow around and walked back to the section, the empty bed light and easy to push. Back at the worksite, he parked the wheelbarrow in its usual spot, near the stump, tilting it forward so that the bed was level and the legs rested firmly on the ground. He set the shovel against the stump, the handle crossing the flat top and the blade resting on the grass, and he stood for a moment looking at the tools he had used all day. They were coated with the evidence of the work. The shovel blade was thick with dried clay, a grey-brown crust that had built up in layers over the afternoon, and the wheelbarrow bed was smeared with the same clay, mixed with bits of gravel and the fine dust of the path. The tools had done their work, and now it was time to return them to order, to clean them and prepare them for the morning that would come. The digger walked to the edge of the meadow, where the grass grew tall and dry, and he gathered a large handful of the coarse stems. The grass was stiff and fibrous, still warm from the sun, and it made a soft rustling sound as he pulled it free. He carried it back to the stump and knelt beside the shovel, laying the grass on the ground next to him. He lifted the shovel and held it across his knees, the blade facing up, and he began to clean it with the same slow, careful attention that he gave to every task. There was a quiet satisfaction in the maintenance of tools, a sense of putting things right after the long disorder of the day. He took a thick wad of the dry grass in his right hand and began to scrape it along the face of the shovel blade. The grass was abrasive enough to loosen the dried clay, but soft enough that it would not scratch the iron, and it left behind a faint green stain that would fade by morning. He worked in small circles, starting at the top of the blade near the collar and moving downward toward the cutting edge. The clay came away in dry flakes and powdery dust, falling onto his trousers and onto the grass below. Where the clay had caked thickly near the center of the blade, he had to rub harder, the grass stems bending and breaking under the pressure, and he replaced the wad with fresh grass several times as the old grass became clogged with dirt. The iron beneath the clay was dark and dull, marked with the fine scratches of 1,000 cuts into the earth. The scratches ran in long, parallel lines from the collar to the edge, a record of every shovelful the tool had lifted since it had last been sharpened. The digger did not sharpen the blade often. The work of digging did not require a keen edge, only a strong one, and the constant friction of the soil kept the iron polished to a kind of matte silver that was smooth to the touch. He ran his thumb along the edge, feeling the slight burr that had developed from striking small stones, and he made a mental note to dress it with a file sometime soon, a task for a rainy day when the digging could not be done. He turned the shovel over and cleaned the back of the blade, which had less clay but more rust. The rust was a fine powdery orange that came off easily with the grass, leaving behind a darker patina that protected the iron from further corrosion. The back of the blade had a maker's mark stamped into it, a simple symbol of the smith who had forged it, a small circle with a cross inside. The mark was faint now, worn down by the soil, but it was still visible, and the digger's thumb passed over it without thought, a brief touch that acknowledged the tool's origin without words. The handle needed cleaning too, though it had less dirt and more sweat. He took a fresh handful of grass and ran it along the shaft from the collar to the top, wiping away the fine grit that had accumulated in the grain of the wood. The wood was ash, light in color but darkened by use, and the cleaning revealed the pale streaks of the grain beneath the darker surface. The grip spot, where the right hand held the handle, was darker than the rest, a deep, warm brown that had been polished by the friction of his palm until it shone faintly. He rubbed this spot with the grass until it was clean and dry, then set the shovel aside, leaning it against the stump once more. The wedge at the top of the handle needed checking, as it did at the end of every day. The wedge was a small piece of hardwood driven into a slot, cut through the top of the shaft, spreading the wood so that it gripped the iron collar of the blade tightly. Over time, the wedge could loosen, the constant vibration of the digging working it upward, and a loose wedge would make the shovel head wobble, making the work harder and less precise. The digger took a small, smooth stone from the pile of pebbles he'd collected earlier and tapped the wedge gently, testing its tightness. It gave a solid, satisfying thunk, a sound that indicated it was still firm, but he gave it a slightly harder tap anyway, just to be sure. The wedge did not move, and he set the stone aside, satisfied. With the shovel clean and checked, he turned his attention to the wheelbarrow. The barrow stood where he had left it, its bed still smeared with clay and its wheel coated with a thick layer of mud mixed with grass clippings. He took another handful of dry grass and began to clean the wooden bed, starting at the front near the wheel and working his way back toward the handles. The clay came off in long, curling strips, revealing the grain of the pine boards beneath. The boards were smooth from use, their edges rounded, and their surfaces worn to a soft grey-brown patina. There were a few deep scratches in the wood where stones had been dragged across it, and a small split near one of the crosspieces that he would need to watch. But otherwise the bed was sound, as sturdy as the day it had been built. He paid special attention to the corners of the bed, where dirt and small stones tended to collect. He picked these out with his fingers, dropping them onto the ground, and then wiped the corners clean with the grass. The crosspieces underneath the bed were harder to reach, but he knelt down and scraped them as best he could, removing the caked mud that had built up around the joints. The joints were tight, the carpenter's work holding true despite the heavy use, and the digger nodded slightly to himself, a small acknowledgement of good craftsmanship. The wheel needed the most care, for it was the wheel that did the hardest work, bearing the full weight of the loaded barrow over the rough ground. He knelt beside it and examined the iron rim, which was caked with a thick layer of dried mud mixed with grass and small stones. He used a flat stick to scrape the worst of the mud away, working it loose in chunks that fell to the ground with soft thuds. Underneath the mud, the iron was bright and clean where the constant rolling had polished it, but there were patches of rust near the hub where the grease did not reach. He wiped these patches with a greasy rag that he kept in a small tin box near the stump, a rag that had been used for this purpose so many times that it was nearly black with old grease and dirt. The grease was made from rendered fat and wood ash, a thick grey paste that smelled faintly of smoke, and he worked it into the rust spots with his thumb, spreading it in a thin protective layer. The hub of the wheel was a simple iron tube that fit over the axle, and it needed to be kept clean and greased so that the wheel would turn freely without squeaking more than necessary. The digger wiped the hub with the rag, removing the grit that had worked its way inside, and then applied a fresh dab of grease to the axle. He spun the wheel slowly, listening to the soft, smooth sound it made, a sound that was almost silent compared to the steady squeak of the working day. The grease would wear away by midday tomorrow, and the squeak would return. But for now, the wheel was quiet, and the digger was content. He cleaned the handles last, the smooth grips that had been under his hands all day. They were dark with sweat and dust, and he wiped them with the grass until they were dry and clean, the wood smooth and cool to the touch. He ran his palms over the grips, feeling the slight indentations that had been worn into the wood by the pressure of his hands over months of use, and he thought, not in words but in a quiet, wordless way, about the partnership between a worker and his tools, the way the tools shaped the hands and the hands shaped the tools, a slow mutual adaptation that made the work easier and the day shorter. With both tools cleaned, he stood up and surveyed the work site. The shovel leaned against the stump, its blade clean and dark, its handle smooth and dry. The wheelbarrow was parked beside it, the bed empty and swept, the wheel greased and ready. The stump itself was tidy, the pebbles he had collected arranged in a small pile at its base, the canteen and the empty cloth bundle sitting on top. The ditch was a dark line in the fading light, its walls straight and its bottom level, and the embankment was a pale ridge in the distance, its surface already blending into the twilight shadows. Everything was in its place, the small corner of the valley restored to order after the long, slow work of the day. He picked up the canteen and the cloth bundle and tucked them into his pocket, then took a last look at the tools. The shovel and the wheelbarrow would stay here overnight, as they always did, leaning against the stump and waiting for the morning. There was no need to carry them back to camp. They were safe here, in the open air, under the wide sky. The dew would settle on them before dawn, a thin layer of moisture that would keep the wood from drying out too much, and the first light would find them exactly as he had left them. The thought was a quiet one, a simple acknowledgement of the cycle that would begin again in a few hours. The light was fading fast now, the sun having slipped below the ridge so that only a soft golden afterglow remained. The sky above the western hills was a band of deep orange that faded upward into a pale hazy blue, and a few early stars were already visible in the darker east. The valley was quiet, the sounds of the other workers having faded away as they finished their own tasks and made their way to their own camps. The birds had settled into the trees, their evening songs giving way to the softer calls of the thrushes and the occasional hoot of an owl from the woods. The air was cool and still, carrying the smell of dry grass and the faint, clean scent of the creek. The digger stood for a moment longer, his hands at his sides, his eyes resting on the tools that had served him through the day. There was no hurry to leave, no pressing need to return to the camp. The evening was his, a stretch of time that belonged to rest and quiet, and he took it slowly, the way he took everything. The satisfaction he felt was not a sharp emotion, not pride or happiness in the usual sense, but a gentle, diffuse sense of rightness, a feeling that the day had been well spent and the tools were well cared for and the world was in good order. He turned away from the stump and began the walk back to the camp, his footsteps slow and even on the path. The grass on either side was already beginning to gather the evening dew, and the blades brushed against his boots with a soft, wet sound. The path curved gently through the meadow, the same path he had walked that morning in the thin grey light, and now it was a pale ribbon in the dusk, visible but fading. He did not look back at the tools. He knew they were there, standing quietly in the growing dark, and he would see them again when the light returned. The camp came into view, the canvas tarp a pale shape among the darker trees, and he walked to the fire ring where the coals of the morning's fire were still warm under a layer of ash. He stirred them with a stick, added a few pieces of kindling, and blew gently until a small flame appeared. The fire crackled softly, its light pushing back the darkness that was gathering under the trees, and he sat down on the stump near the ring, the same stump where he had sat that morning with his coffee. The valley was now a deep blue-grey, the hills a darker silhouette against the sky, and the stars were multiplying overhead, small cold points of light that had travelled unimaginable distances to shine down on this quiet corner of the earth. He poured water from the bucket into the tin pot and set it on the fire to heat for his evening meal. While he waited, he took off his boots and set them beside the stump, the leather still warm from his feet. He stretched his toes in the cool grass and leaned back, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes on the fire. The day's work was behind him. The tools were clean and ready, and the night was settling in with a deep, abiding peace. The fire popped once, a small sound that was swallowed by the silence, and the digger sat still, his breathing slow and even, as the last light of the evening faded completely from the sky and the valley was wrapped in the quiet dark. The tools were clean and the work was done, and the digger stood for a moment beside the stump where the shovel leaned and the wheelbarrow rested. The evening light had deepened into a soft, diffuse glow, the sun now well below the western ridge, and the sky, a gradient of amber and pale blue that would soon give way to the first true dark. The air was cooling rapidly, the warmth of the afternoon retreating into the ground, and a light breeze had begun to move through the meadow grass, carrying the scent of dry clover and the faint mineral smell of the creek. It was the time between work and rest, a quiet threshold that the digger crossed without ceremony, as he did every evening. He reached down and took the shovel from its leaning place, the handle smooth and dry in his grip, the blade clean and dark. The shovel felt lighter now than it did during the working hours, not because its weight had changed, but because the urgency had gone out of his muscles, leaving behind only a comfortable awareness of the tool's presence. He lifted the wheelbarrow by its handles, tilting it forward so that the iron wheel rose from the rut it had worn in the soil, and he began to walk away from the canal cut, away from the stump and the ditch and the embankment, toward a spot he knew, a place set apart from the work where the evening rest would come. He did not go far. Just beyond the line of survey stakes, where the cleared corridor gave way to the natural meadow, there was a small rise in the ground, a gentle swell that lifted a few feet above the surrounding grass. The rise was not much, hardly a hill, but it was enough to give a slight view over the valley and to catch the last light of the day longer than the lower ground. The grass there was thick and soft, a mix of timothy and fescue that had not been trampled by the passage of men and barrows, and it grew in a dense green mat that was still mostly green, only just beginning to show the gold of full summer. The digger had taken his rest on this rise many times before, and the ground there was slightly flattened from the pressure of his body, a shallow depression that fit him like a nest. He pushed the wheelbarrow up the gentle slope of the rise, the wheel turning easily over the thick grass, and he stopped at the highest point, where the ground was level enough to park the barrow without it tilting. He set the barrow down carefully, the legs settling into the grass with a soft crunch, and he leaned the shovel against its side. The shovel handle crossed the wheelbarrow's frame at a natural angle, the top of the handle resting against the front of the bed and the blade planted in the grass, so that both tools stood as a single stable shape, upright and easy to find in the morning. The arrangement was simple and practical, a habit formed over many evenings, and the digger glanced at it once to make sure it was secure before turning his attention to the ground itself. He lowered himself to the grass slowly, first bending his knees and placing one hand on the ground to steady himself, then letting his weight settle onto his side. The grass was cool against his clothing, the blades soft and slightly damp from the evening moisture that was already beginning to gather. He sat for a moment, his legs stretched out in front of him, his hands resting on his thighs, and he looked out at the valley that was now fading into the blue-grey of early dusk. The canal cut was a dark line snaking through the meadow, and the embankment was a paler line beside it, and the distant trees along the creek were a soft, indistinct mass that merged with the shadows. The other workers had all gone to their own resting places, and the valley was empty of human movement, silent except for the whisper of the breeze and the distant murmur of the Genesee River. After a while he shifted his position, leaning back onto his elbows and then lowering himself further until his back was flat on the ground. The grass cradled him softly, the blades bending under his weight to form a natural cushion that was both supportive and yielding. He stretched out fully, his legs straight and his arms loose at his sides, and for a moment he simply lay there, looking up at the sky. The sky was vast and open above the meadow, unbroken by trees or hills in this direction, and the first faint stars were beginning to appear in the darker east, tiny pinpricks of light that flickered and steadied as he watched. The western sky still held a band of warm color, a pale gold that shaded upward into a soft, hazy blue, and the clouds that had been thin and scattered during the day were now tinted with pink at their edges, hanging motionless in the still air. He moved his arms slowly, bringing his hands up behind his head and lacing his fingers together to form a cradle for his skull. The position was one he had learned long ago, a way of resting that let the back of his head rest on the thick part of his palms while his elbows pointed outward to either side, and it allowed him to lie flat while still looking up at the sky without strain. The grass tickled the backs of his arms and the nape of his neck, a soft, pleasant sensation that was barely noticed. He settled into the position with a small sigh, the breath leaving his body in a slow, even stream, and he let his weight sink fully into the ground beneath him. The earth was still warm from the day's sun, a deep stored heat that rose up through the grass and into his back, his shoulders, his legs. It was not the sharp heat of midday, but a gentle, steady warmth that seemed to radiate from the very heart of the ground, a residual comfort that the soil had absorbed over the long afternoon and was now releasing slowly into the cooling air. The warmth seeped into his muscles, loosening the last of the tension that the work had left behind, and he felt his body soften and spread, his spine settling into the natural curves of the earth, his shoulders broadening against the grass. The contrast between the warm ground and the cool air on his face was pleasing, a balanced sensation that seemed to mark the boundary between the day that was ending and the night that was beginning. His breathing slowed almost immediately, the rhythm of it shifting from the steady, working pace of the afternoon to a deeper, more relaxed cadence that matched the stillness of the rise. He breathed in through his nose, drawing the cool evening air into his lungs, and then let it out through his mouth in a soft, unhurried exhalation that stirred the grass near his face. Each breath was a small release, a letting go of the alertness that had held him through the hours of labor, and with each exhale he felt himself sinking just a little deeper into the ground, a little further from the waking world. His eyes remained open, fixed on the sky, but his focus softened, the stars and the clouds becoming a gentle blur that he observed without truly seeing. The shovel and the wheelbarrow stood beside him like quiet companions, their shapes dark and still against the fading light. The shovel handle rose from the grass at a slight angle, crossing the barrow's frame in a simple geometry of wood and iron, and the wheelbarrow's bed was a dark hollow that held the gathering shadows. They did not move. They did not make a sound. They were simply there as they had been all day and as they would be again in the morning, silent witnesses to the rest that claimed the digger now. He was aware of them in a peripheral way, the same way he was aware of the rise beneath him and the sky above, as part of the landscape of his rest, and their presence was a comfort, a reminder that the work was done and the tools were ready and all was in order. The sky continued to change, the colors shifting through a slow, imperceptible gradient that moved from amber to gold to a deeper, richer orange before beginning to fade toward the pale violet of twilight. The digger watched this change without tracking it, his eyes taking in the whole sweep of the sky at once, and he noticed how the clouds that had been pink at their edges were now a soft, muted gray, their shapes gradually dissolving into the darkening blue. The stars grew brighter and more numerous as the light faded, and he could pick out the familiar patterns now, the bright points of the early summer constellations that he had learned to recognize over years of sleeping under open skies. He did not name them, he simply knew them, as he knew the shape of the valley and the feel of the shovel handle, a knowledge that was deeper than words. A single bird called from the woods to the south, a long, wavering note that hung in the air for a moment before fading into silence. It was the last call of the evening, the final marker of the day's birdsong, and after it, the valley was quiet except for the soft, continuous sound of the river in the distance, a sound so constant that it was almost a silence in itself. The breeze had died down now and the grass was still, the blades no longer rustling, but standing motionless in the cooling air. Even the insects had quieted, waiting perhaps for the full dark before beginning their nightly chorus, and the world was suspended in a deep, tranquil pause that seemed to hold everything in place. The digger's breathing grew even slower, the rise and fall of his chest barely perceptible against the darkening grass. His hands, still cradling his head, had relaxed completely, the fingers loose and slightly curled, the palms warm against his hair. His boots rested on the grass, the soles flat and the toes pointing upward, and his legs were slightly apart, a position of complete ease. He could feel the steady beat of his heart, a slow, low pulse that seemed to come from the ground itself, as if the earth had its own quiet heartbeat that matched his own. His thoughts, which had been drifting loosely through his mind as he worked, had now slowed to a near standstill, each one floating up and then dissolving before it could fully form, like the last wisps of mist on a warming morning. He thought about the warmth of the soil and the cool of the air, about the way the grass smelled sweet and green beneath him. He thought about the creek and the alders and the round stones in the shallows, and then that thought was gone, replaced by the image of the shovel blade sinking into the clay, and then that too faded, leaving only a soft, empty calm. He did not hold on to any thought or push any away. He let them come and go with the same patient stillness that he brought to every part of his life, and the space between thoughts grew wider and longer, until there was almost nothing but the sky and the ground and the quiet. The light had now drained completely from the west, leaving only a faint grey glow on the horizon that would persist for another hour before the true dark set in. The stars were fully out, a thick scattering of bright and dim points that stretched from one side of the sky to the other, and a thin crescent of moon had risen above the eastern hills, its pale light adding a faint silvery sheen to the meadow. The digger's eyes caught the moonlight and held it for a moment, his pupils wide and dark, and then his gaze softened again, drifting across the sky, without fixing on any one point. The moon was a quiet presence, a cool counterpoint to the warm earth beneath him, and its light was so faint that it cast no shadows, only a gentle luminescence that seemed to hover above the grass. The position of his body was one of deep, earned stillness, the kind of stillness that comes not from exhaustion, but from the satisfaction of a full day's work well completed. Every muscle had done its task and was now at rest, the fibers lengthening and softening in the warmth of the ground, and his joints had settled into comfortable alignments that required no adjustment. There was no part of him that needed to move, no itch or ache or restlessness that disturbed the quiet. He was as still as the shovel beside him, as the wheelbarrow on the rise, as the earth itself, and the stillness was a gift that he accepted without thought, a natural part of the day's cycle. Time passed without being measured, the minutes slipping by in the slow, even rhythm of his breathing. The sky continued its gradual darkening, the stars wheeling imperceptibly overhead, and the crescent moon climbed a little higher, its light growing slightly brighter as the last of the twilight faded. The digger's eyes began to close, not all at once but in long, slow blinks that grew heavier and more frequent, the lids lowering and then lifting again, each time staying closed a moment longer. The darkness behind his eyelids was warm and red-brown, the after-image of the sky, and it was as peaceful as the open darkness above, a different kind of seeing that required no effort at all. He did not fight the heaviness, he let it come, his breathing growing even deeper and more regular, his hands still cradling his head, his body still and warm against the earth. The boundary between wakefulness and sleep was so soft that it could not be marked, a gradual transition that blurred the edges of consciousness until there was no clear line separating the two. He was aware of the ground beneath him, the grass around him, the tools beside him, and then he was not, his awareness fading into a diffuse, dreamless calm that was deeper than rest and lighter than sleep. The night settled over the rise, over the canal cut and the embankment and the creek, over the whole wide valley, and the digger rested in the heart of it, as still and as peaceful as the land itself. The weight of the day settled into the ground beneath him, a slow sinking pressure that seemed to press his body deeper into the grass with each passing minute. The earth had cooled now, the stored warmth of the afternoon sun gradually dissipating into the night air, but a faint residual heat still lingered in the soil, enough to keep the digger comfortable as he lay on the rise with his head cradled on his arms and his eyes half closed against the darkening sky. The crest of the moon had climbed higher over the eastern hills, a thin crescent of pale silver that cast a faint, ghostly light across the meadow, and the stars had multiplied until the sky was thick with them, a dense scattering of bright and dim points that stretched from horizon to horizon in a great silent arc. The sounds of the valley were few now, reduced to a handful of quiet, distant notes that seemed to come from very far away, as if the world had drawn back from the rise and left it in a small pocket of silence. The distant murmur of the Genesee River was the most constant of these sounds, a low, continuous hush that rose and fell in volume as the night air shifted, sometimes almost audible, and sometimes fading to a whisper that was barely there. The river was a mile away, maybe more, winding through the bottom of the valley on its own ancient course, and its voice was a soft, watery breath that had been part of the valley's sound since long before the canal was imagined, a sound that would continue long after the last boat had passed through the locks. The digger heard it without listening, the way one hears one's own breathing, as a familiar background to the quiet. The last few notes of a thrush came from the woods to the south, a series of clear, fluting calls that rang out, once, twice, 3 times, and then fell silence. The thrush had been singing its evening song for the past hour, a complex, wandering melody that had filled the twilight with its liquid notes, but now it was done, settling onto its roost for the night, and the woods were dark and still. A moment after the thrush stopped, a faint creak came from the wheelbarrow on the rise, a small sound made by the cooling of the iron wheel as the night air drew the last heat from the metal. The creak was soft and brief, a single note that hung in the air for less than a breath and then was gone, and the wheelbarrow was silent again, its shape dark and motionless against the stars. The shovel did not move. The wheelbarrow did not move. They stood exactly as he had left them, the handle crossing the barrow's frame, the blade planted in the grass, and they were as still as the earth itself, as still as the rise and the grass and the distant hills. The dew was beginning to form on the iron blade, a thin, invisible film of moisture that would gather into small droplets by morning and run down the metal in slow silver beads. The wood of the handle and the wheelbarrow bed would absorb the dew, swelling just slightly in the night damp, and the grip spot would be cool to the touch when he picked up the shovel again. But that was hours away, a future that had not yet arrived, and for now the tools rested in their own quiet way, keeping their silence under the moon. The digger's eyes were now fully closed, the lids heavy and still, and the darkness behind them was deep and warm. His breathing had slowed to a rhythm that was barely perceptible. Each inhale a long, soft draw of the cool night air, each exhale a gentle release that stirred the grass near his mouth. And there was no pause between the breaths, no break in the cycle, just a smooth, continuous flow that moved in and out without effort. His chest rose and fell with a motion that was so slight that it hardly disturbed the fabric of his shirt, and his hands, still laced behind his head, had relaxed completely, the fingers loose and warm. The rise and fall of his breathing was matched to the quiet pulse of the valley, the slow rhythm of the night that was measured not in seconds but in the gradual turning of the stars. His thoughts, which had been drifting loosely through his mind as he lay down, had now become so scattered and diffuse that they could hardly be called thoughts at all. They were more like impressions, faint shapes that floated through his awareness without leaving any mark, thin clouds of memory and sensation that dissolved before they could take form. He did not think about the canal, or the shovel, or the wheelbarrow. He did not think about the work that waited for him in the morning, or the section of ditch that would need deepening. Those concerns had fallen away, one by one, as his body had settled into the grass, and what remained was only a quiet, wordless calm, a stillness that filled his mind the way the darkness filled the sky. There was an image that drifted briefly through his awareness, a fragment of the day that had passed, the way the afternoon light had slanted across the meadow, turning the dust to gold, and the sound of the shovel blade scraping against the clay. It lingered for a moment, soft and distant, like a half-remembered dream, and then it faded, replaced by nothing at all, a blank, peaceful emptiness that was deeper than thought. The image came and went without effort, and the digger did not hold on to it or push it away. He simply let it pass, the way the valley let the breeze pass, without resistance. The rising moon had now reached a point about halfway up the eastern sky, and its light had grown slightly brighter, enough to cast a very faint shadow of the wheelbarrow on the grass, a thin, elongated shape that stretched across the rise. The moonlight touched the digger's face, a cool, pale glow that highlighted the curve of his cheek and the line of his jaw. But he did not feel it, his senses having withdrawn into the deep inner quiet of approaching sleep. The moonlight also touched the shovel blade, glinting faintly on the film of dew that was forming there, and it touched the canal cut in the distance, the dark line of the ditch reflecting a single, thin stripe of silver that ran along its bottom for a few yards before disappearing into the shadow of the embankment. The canal cut waited, an empty channel in the dusk, its walls straight and its bottom level, the work of many days preserved in the stillness of the night. No water flowed in it yet, no boat moved along its length, no mule walked on the towpath ridge that rose beside it. The channel was a dry line cut into the meadow, a shape of what was to come, and in the moonlight it looked like a quiet scar, a mark on the land that was still healing. But the digger did not see it. His eyes closed and his breathing deep, and the canal was just another part of the valley that rested under the same sky, waiting for the same morning. The night advanced in its slow, imperceptible way, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, the moon climbing higher and then beginning its own slow descent toward the west. The air grew cooler still, the temperature dropping by another degree or two, and the light mist began to form in the hollows of the meadow, thin white tendrils that curled through the grass near the creek and spread slowly outward across the lower ground. The mist did not reach the rise where the digger lay above the coolest air, but it filled the distant parts of the valley with a soft, pale haze that blurred the line of the canal and made the trees along the creek look like islands floating in a shallow sea. The boundary between rest and sleep, which had been soft and indistinct when the digger first lay down, had now become so thin that it could not be marked at all. His breathing had settled into a depth that was beyond conscious control, the rhythm regulated by the body's own quiet wisdom, and his muscles had loosened completely, the fibers soft and warm against the earth. His face was smooth and expressionless, the small lines around his eyes and mouth relaxed into stillness, and his whole body had the weight and the peace of true sleep. A sleep that was not troubled by dreams or disturbed by sounds. a sleep that was as deep and as quiet as the valley itself. The night sounds continued around him. The distant murmur of the river, the soft rustle of a small animal moving through the grass somewhere down the slope, the occasional hoot of an owl from the woods. But these sounds did not penetrate his rest. They were part of the night, as natural and as expected as the stars and the moon, and they asked for no response. The digger slept through them as the earth slept through the passing of the breeze, undisturbed, unchanging, still. The shovel stood beside him, the handle crossing the wheelbarrow's frame, the blade dark with dew, and it waited with the patience of a thing that had no need for time. The wheelbarrow sat on its legs, the iron wheel cool and silent, the wooden bed dry inside where the dew had not settled, and it too waited. The tools were ready for the morning, just as the digger would be ready when the first light woke him, and the cycle would begin again, the rising, the fire, the coffee and bread, the walk to the section, the shovel sinking into the earth, the wheelbarrow rolling along the path, the slow, steady rhythm of the work that stretched from one end of the valley to the other. But that cycle was still a night away, a future that rested just beyond the darkness, and for now there was only the quiet, only the sleep, only the small rise in the meadow where the digger lay with his tools beside him. The mist in the hollows thickened slightly, spreading in a thin white layer that covered the lower meadow and began to creep up the gentle slopes toward the rise. It moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, a silent advance that would reach the digger's resting place by the early hours of the morning and wrap him in a cool, damp veil. But he would not wake from it. The mist was gentle, a soft blanket that would settle over him without disturbing his rest, and when the sun rose it would burn the mist away, leaving only the dew on the grass and the clean, fresh smell of the new day. The last of the twilight had long since faded from the western sky, and the night was now fully dark, the only light coming from the moon and the stars. The crescent cast shadows that were faint and soft-edged, and the stars provided a diffuse, silvery glow that was just enough to see by if one's eyes were adjusted to the dark. The valley was a landscape of muted tones, greys and blues and deep shadowed greens, and the canal cut was a dark ribbon that wound through it, a line of deeper darkness against the paler meadow. Everything was still, everything was quiet, and the peace that had settled over the valley was complete. The digger's sleep deepened further, passing from the light drifting stage into a profound stillness that was as close to the earth's own sleep as a living thing could come. His breathing was so slow and so shallow that it was almost part of the night air itself, a gentle movement that stirred the grass only slightly, and his heart beat with a slow, steady pulse that matched the deep, quiet rhythm of the resting land. He was not aware of the moon or the stars or the mist or the tools beside him. He was not aware of his own body or his own breath. He was simply there, a man at rest on the grass of the Genesee Valley, and the night held him in its calm, unchanging embrace. The world turned slowly toward morning, the stars completing their long arc across the sky, the moon sinking toward the western hills, the mist thickening and then beginning to thin as the first hint of dawn approached far beyond the eastern ridge. But that was still hours away, a distant future that had not yet touched the quiet of the rise. For now, in the deep, still heart of the night, the digger rested with his shovel and his wheelbarrow beside him, and the valley was at peace. The canal waited, the tools waited, the earth waited, and nothing moved except the slow, silent progress of the stars, marking the hours until the light returned and the day began again.